going to be, a lot of times when we speak in the past, it was like, well, we don't really have that much, there's not that many changes, but in probably the last 6 years or so, it's been just change. So we've got some pretty interesting topics. And since we've got a smaller group, just stop if you have any questions along the way. So, they can be more interactive. So, we're not up here just kind of lecturing. So stop us at any time. What we are going to talk about, which one do I hit? That one?
Yeah.
Cool. So these are some of our topics. I'm going to go over what you are seeing in other countries right now as far as their COVID protocols, what we're seeing at the United States consulates, which are located all over the world. USCIS is the immigration service here in the United States. The consulates, they're the ones that issue the visas. And then we're going to talk about U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And these are the folks at the airport that let you in once you've gotten your visa from the consulate, and best practices for a global migration program. So to get started, just recently, those that are coming to the United States no longer need to show proof of a negative COVID test. And that was quite an issue. I know, I go to Mexico quite a bit, and you'd stay at a resort and you'd have to do your COVID test before you could even get on a plane to come back. So that is no longer in place, but non-U.S. citizen air travelers to the U.S. have to be fully vaccinated. And what will happen is they check all this out before you board your flight. And if not, they're not going to let you on the flight. One thing to keep in mind, this was as of a week ago. These things are changing constantly. Canada, you have to be fully vaccinated. I follow baseball, and we just had the trade deadline this past week, and there were some players that were saying, if I may, because there's a team in Canada, and they may be in the playoffs. So there was a lot of talk, well, if you're not vaccinated, you're not going to be able to go up and play. Canada's not going to let you in. So there were some that said, okay, if I get traded and and it's a team that's going to playoffs, I will go to Canada. I'll get vaccinated before. So Canada's pretty strict about it. Mexico, so far, they've been fairly, a little more relaxed than a lot of countries. Brazil, you have to be vaccinated to get in. And a lot of my clients are going to Brazil all the time, so they've had to make sure they're vaccinated. But then you've got Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile open to everybody. And then you've got the other countries in South America open to all who are vaccinated. Others have to show a negative PCR or COVID-19 test. And it'll vary by country and often by where you're flying into. Okay, so your Asia Pac regions, I think those are the strictest. You've got to get approval before going into Singapore. And then it says you have to self-isolate. A lot of countries are making you pay if you're going to self-isolate, they make you're responsible for paying for your stay. So let's say if you're going into a country and you plan on traveling around the country, well, you're going to have to isolate in that location and pay for your own hotel stay. So, if you've got a 7-day stay and you're in Singapore, that can add up. Indonesia, you can only go through certain airports, and this is something you've got to have international travel insurance with at least $100,000 of coverage. Thailand, you have to have $50,000 worth of coverage. And with Malaysia, some tourism is allowed, but you can only go into certain regions. Most of the countries in Asia Pac, they are open to business travelers, but you've got to jump through a lot of hoops. Tourism isn't as easy. I have a friend that went to Thailand a few months ago, said it wasn't too bad, but now they've suspended quarantine-free travel. So, Philippines, they're going to test you. Australia used to be real tough. You just basically, even Australian citizens would arrive and they would have to quarantine. Yeah, they still make you quarantine, but like it was for almost 10 days. New Zealand is more or less closed to most travelers. Japan, they were open, now they've closed up. It says unless travel for essential purposes, that would probably be your travel or extreme like family emergency. And then you can see South Korea mandatory 10-day quarantine at a government-approved facility. So you'd probably want to check into that first. I probably wouldn't be too excited to see where they're going to put you. China, you've got a 14-day quarantine. Taiwan, again, strict requirements. You must have a ranger quarantine upon arrival. India, 7-day quarantine. And if you're only going to go for a business meeting for 3 days, and you've got, like, say, a 2-week quarantine, that's not good. This surprised me. In the Middle East, they are fairly open right now. I expected them to have probably stricter quarantine requirements, but it varies from country to country, but they right now are fairly liberal with their policies. So on the U.S. consulate, I'll hand it over.
Yeah. So I always like to see how COVID protocols are being implemented from country to country. Just shows you how each place is just so different. And in an already complex immigration landscape globally, and we're going to talk about the U.S. part now, COVID just has brought everyone to their knees, and the movement of people in and out of the country, even domestically, right? You're just seeing the airports really starting to start picking up, and so I just find it really interesting to see what each country is doing. So let's talk about the U.S. And what I like to always start with is just a reminder of how the U.S. immigration system is kind of structured, right? You have immigration laws, which are made by the U.S. Congress. And as we know, this is not a political statement, but we haven't had any major change in immigration for over 40 years. So that means laws have not changed in over 40 years. That's a long time for any law to stay stagnant, and immigration is no exception. And so why does that matter? Because it then becomes a function, and it's even in the Constitution, of the executive branch. So that is our president. And so the president also has oversight over different departments, like the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And the reason why immigration law or policy is always changing is it really depends on who is in office. And we see all of it on the news all the time, right? We see it talked about at the border and all that stuff. But for our particular purpose, it really impacts companies, and especially global companies, a lot. So as Kelly mentioned earlier, and I'll kind of go over this again, U.S. immigration policy goes to a bunch of different departments. We have the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Kelly's going to briefly talk about USCIS. USCIS is the benefit-giving arm of the government, so you apply for a benefit like getting a green card. They're the ones that grant that for you. U.S. Department of Labor, they're the ones that make sure that you don't displace U.S. workers. So if you want to get a green card, you have to do a labor certification to ensure that there are no qualified U.S. workers that can perform the duties of the job. And then you have the U.S. Department of State. So those are really our embassies and consulates abroad, right? They are charged with ensuring that they do not allow individuals that shouldn't be coming to the United States into the United States. Just as an aside, people always ask us, were you busy during the pandemic? No one was moving anywhere. I will say we were still busy. The reason why is because there are so many workers in the United States that already have an existing visa, and those companies need to extend or renew those visas. So we stayed pretty busy, I mean, not as busy as now, but we stayed pretty busy even though there wasn't a huge global movement of individuals. But now what's happening is post-COVID, and in this new administration, U.S. consulates are starting to open again, some of them. And so there's two things that have happened. During the previous administration, and because of COVID, over 400 government jobs were lost, specifically at the U.S. Department of State. And that impacted the embassies and consulates abroad, right? Now, Kelly put this because she had the new stats. So 60 new officers were hired recently. 60.
Yeah, we were all very excited.
We were
like,
excited,
oh, that's
yes.
awesome.
We were excited.
And then.
Yeah, but 400 were lost,
Yeah.
right? And so this is all kind of compounding because what's happening is companies are reaching out to us and say, hey, we need to move somebody in our South Korea office, our UK office, and bring them into the United States. And there's a visa that's usually very easy for that to happen. It's called an L1 intercompany transfer visa. And we use those all the time. There's blankets that allow it to be easy, but then the problem is, when am I going to get my appointment, right? And so that's what's happening at the consulates right now. All the embassies and consulates have a mind and a management style of their own. And they rotate. The people rotate. So you could be a embassy official in London one day, and then about 2 years later, you'll end up in Singapore. So they move people around. And if you move people around, those personalities follow. And so we have seen some consulates, like London, during COVID, that just kind of came to a standstill. They were actually sued by a bunch of companies because they weren't moving. We're seeing that in the Netherlands now, in Amsterdam. They've slowed down, but they're starting to pick back up. Burma, completely shut down. Okay, that's another example. Australia is one that's probably going to get sued next, right? So you have all these embassies and consulates that are having a mind of their own. Yes, and so that's the second point. Currently, there are delays in obtaining appointments. And so the big practical advice that you're going to take away from all of this is if you're hiring foreign national workers, and there's a reason for that, and it kind of goes to what Sarah was saying earlier, the global workforce, right? The reason the global workforce is so important is why? Right now we're seeing it. U.S. workers aren't working, right? We just, I mean, they are working, but they're not working. They want it a certain way, and so some companies are actually saying, if I can't find a U.S. worker, saying, Kelly, can you help us with identifying foreign workers? And I always tell them I am a lawyer, and I cannot help you find people, and that's why I was glad I ran into Sarah yesterday because she can help me do that. But to that point, what I'm saying is companies are starting to say, especially in STEM, we can't find the U.S. workers that are going to come in. We found a candidate, but they require a visa, or we found them in the UK. How do we get them here, right? And so this is why this is very important, because it kind of helps, it talks about this whole shortage of workforce. So the practical component, schedule appointments as early as possible. And so what we're doing now is as soon as an offer is made by a company to maybe transfer one of their own from another one of their global companies, a resource, that's the first thing we do. We find a way to schedule their appointment. And this is what's funny about it. We schedule the appointment, but it's in 2023. Yeah. So then they start freaking out, and we're like, so I need them tomorrow? Yeah. Yeah, I need them tomorrow. Yeah. Yeah. So what happens then is we have to do a couple of things. The foreign national workers, they want to be here as well, right? People schedule appointments, but then they'll cancel them. Cancellations occur on a daily basis. So what happens is that HR usually puts it on the employer foreign national to start monitoring those dates, check in every day, see if you can get an earlier appointment. And you know, overwhelmingly, you will get an earlier appointment if you keep that regimen. The last part is not as applicable anymore. There used to be waivers for certain individuals. Like, for example, there's a huge shortage of nurses in the U.S. They used to issue waivers for those types of things. The waiver process has now been replaced with what we call an expedited processing. So depending upon if the worker is an essential worker and depending upon the consulate, you are able to request an expedited appointment. So my appointment was January 2023, but I need this person tomorrow, right? Will you please expedite? And depending upon the reason, the U.S. embassies and consulates will say yes. And some of those reasons, especially from a business perspective, include, hey, we have this huge project. We're creating U.S. jobs. Our company is worth, X million billion dollars. We employ X foreign workers, and if we don't have this individual, it brings a lot of our processes to a halt. We make those arguments, and many times the U.S. Embassy and Consulate takes that into account and say, approved, okay? Foreign nationals try to do it on their own. Don't let them, okay? They need the expertise of both HR and maybe their immigration lawyers to ensure that they're putting the best foot forward. So that's what's happened at that's what's happening at U.S. consulates today. There is some hope in terms of what we're going to see in the future as we get more officers, if they want to come back. We're going to see a lessening of that. Different embassies and consulates are going to reopen again. I mentioned Burma and Thailand. Here's the Thailand as well. They actually stopped all processing, but they allow for F1. F1 is a student visa. So they will allow people to come to our universities, but they won't get these other appointments for work. Very interesting. But what they're saying is that we will reopen our processing of workers in the very near future. And so we really think it's because of the fact that there is this stretch in shortage in work for those consulates and embassies. So just keep that in mind. And so this really comes into play in two places. If you've identified a resource outside of the United States and you want to bring them in, they have to go to the U.S. consulate first. Or the other scenario is if you have a foreign worker that is inside the United States and they have to travel internationally and their visa stamps, which are in their passports, have expired. And so the consulate and embassy's primary role is to issue, as Kelly said, the visa stamp in the passport. A visa stamp pretty much says, I have permission to enter the United States, so please give me that stamp, all right? Now, it doesn't go to work authorization, and that's what USCIS's job is, and Kelly, I think you're going to take over in the beginning here.
So, as Sang was explaining, USCIS is Citizenship and Immigration Service. This is the former INS, Immigration and Naturalization Service. And they have their big service centers around the country where they process applications, petitions, and then they're going to have local offices. Like there's an office in San Antonio, there's one in Houston and Dallas, and then out in El Paso. So a lot of times clients will say, well, can I just drive up to the service center and check on my case? No, it's not. They don't let you in. So right now we are still filing everything with big packets of paper. They are trying to go electronic. They've got to figure out how to, accept payment if they do that. We've got to figure out how we're going to pay them, because I don't think, you're going to have a credit card with, $100,000 limit. I guess you could. But, so yeah, they're trying to get up to speed. So this has been one of the biggest improvements. An EAD is an employment authorization document, and there are certain categories of people that come in on a certain type of visa, and they're able to apply for an EAD. Like usually it's going to be a spouse of a L company transfer or an E spouse. H4, that's a spouse of an H1B, and in certain circumstances they can also get an EAD. Your students that are here working, they get an EAD. People that are here for asylum, if they're fleeing their home country, they get an EAD. It sounds like Oprah. Everybody gets an EAD. But so what happens is they take your money, your filing fee check, and then it just goes into the queue that I think it said it could be anywhere from 2 months to 20 months. So what we were doing is we were filing these, and they were taking so long that, well, within 6 months of expiration for the one we just filed, so they were getting bombarded. So what they have put in place is if you come in as an E-spouse, an E visa is, the U.S. has a treaties with many different countries. And one, it's, if you are a foreign company or a foreign investor and you want to open a business here, if you are from one of those treaty countries, you can do that and you can bring in your employees on these E-visas. Well, the spouses, have work authorization. They just can't get the EAD. Your L2 spouses, same thing. They can all work. I mean, they're eligible. They just can't get that document to fill out their I-9. Okay? That's what the problem. So the Immigration Service said, hey, it's automatic. If you're an E2 or an L2 spouse, you can work. You don't need an EAD. So they said, okay, that's great, but how do we complete a Form I-9? Oh yeah, well, we didn't think about that. So for those that entered the U.S. After January of this year, they put an S. So your L2S or is it E2S. So that's perfect for them. There are people that haven't traveled, and I'll tell you about them in in a few minutes. But there was a way to fix it to where they can work. So basically, the E's and the L's, spouses don't have to wait for these EADs anymore, which is excellent. Now, if you are the spouse of an H-1B holder and your H-1B, the employee's far enough in the green card process, that spouse can get an EAD. So they don't get that treatment like the E2s and L2 spouses do. So if you are filing an application to renew your EAD, and if you file it before it's expiring, then you get 540 days of continued work authorization, which is huge because there are quite a few of these H4E and L spouses that are working, and it's a hardship to an employer if they have to stop working. So that's really good news for these groups. They're not at the mercy of the Immigration Service anymore. The last administration wanted to get rid of the H4 spousal work authorization. It kept coming up every few months. That never occurred, and hopefully it'll stay in place. And one thing with those EADs, I know working with companies, oftentimes, the company and the employee, they're ready to make the move to the United States. But often the move is stopped because that spouse is not going to be able to work here. So this has really made a big difference in making it more attractive to come to the U.S. as a family to work. So those are, some of the things that we're seeing on that topic. And Sane's going to talk about the dreaded request for evidence.
Yes. So, and what do we, and just by way of review, remember that U.S. Embassy and Consulate abroad, they issue the visa stamp, right? So that's your right to travel into the United States. USCIS is part of the Department of Homeland Security. They're the benefit-giving arm, right? So most of your applications within the United States, they start here. Your extensions are usually here with USCIS. And COVID, in my opinion, like we just received a final ruling this week, I think, or last week, that they're starting to do this electronic, receipt of applications. Most countries around the world have always received electronic applications. Yeah. Only USCIS has been antiquated in taking these physical filings, right? And I'm talking about filings that are like this big.
Lots and lots
Yeah.
of paper.
So why does that matter? So COVID did a number Because as soon as COVID hit, all those USCIS workers were at home. They didn't have a way to look at things electronically, so that paper just sat. They had this rotating schedule where they went in and out, right? And benefits were not being given. Well, if that happens, processing times are going to lengthen, lengthen, lengthen. And so the EAD situation was already long before. But then once COVID hit, it extended. So again, since Congress isn't going to pass a law about it, there has to be an executive order. There has to be some sort of policy, brought down by the Homeland Security Secretary to say, we're going to allow for this new 540-day extension of work authorization where it used to only be 180 days.
So in Sam's right, it's policy.
Yeah, all policy.
And it's not, it's easier to issue an executive order or the Immigration Service to come out with a policy versus a change in the law.
Right.
So that's.
So I'm setting us up right here because all of this, I just want everyone to know what the state of affairs are and what mindset is. And then, of course, all of these government entities, there's a high level of discretion, meaning each officer has their own discretion to apply laws. And just legally speaking, I'm going to geek out for a second. Lawyers use different standards of review, right? So in criminal law, you have beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Which means you have to be really certain that that person is guilty. There's clear and convincing, which means about 75% of it has to be true. Immigration is civil, meaning that it is preponderance of the evidence. More likely than not. So at least 51% of what you're telling me has to be true in order for me to approve your case. Seems like a very easy standard. It should be a very easy standard, especially not one where you have to file a filing this big physically, right? But then this beautiful thing happens, and before I get here, USCIS is also fully funded by companies or people that apply for benefits. So when there's a government shutdown, right, USCIS survives because they are all funded. So you have to pay fees each time.
Like they generate revenue.
Yeah, they generate revenue. I mean, it's
the only government.
they're the richest government entity there is. But so this is interesting, right? So you have at least 51%, right, that has to be true. You have these huge filings, and you file them, and then almost immediately, some of these visas are met with what we call the request for evidence, or the RFE, all right? Request for evidence pretty much means the officer did not think there was enough evidence in your 400, 500 file pack, and they are sending you a request for more evidence.
And I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. I would maybe see a request for evidence, maybe one a year. I mean, that was it.
Yeah, and now they're like, yeah.
You probably get a few a day.
So let's continue down this path of the RFE, right? So there's also a process called premium processing, which means your filing usually can take about 5 to 6 months. Now that filing or that processing has taken up to like 10 months on certain visas. Premium processing is an additional fee that you can pay to USCIS that will allow you, right, to get a decision within 15 days. Yeah. It used to be 1,000, and then it was 1,225, and now it's 2,500. Okay?
See, that's why they're generating revenue.
Yeah.
You pay for them to do their efficiently.
Yeah. So $2,500. So you get an initial decision within 15 days. And so you file and you have a stretched USCIS that has a backlog. What do you think they're going to do? They are going to buy time and issue the RFE. All right?
Because we almost beg clients, no, don't do premium processing. Because we know they want to keep that check, but they want to buy that time. And you're just like, oh, please.
Yeah.
Nobody's told us that. We've been paying for premium.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like $2,500. You get the RFE. That RFE is a boilerplate template. They ask you for the same stuff that you've already provided. And then the company has to say, well, I've already sent all this stuff. So then they're looking at us and they say, we already sent this. So what do the lawyers have to do with their companies now? They have to be a little more strategic. So what we do is we give them 75, 80% of what they're looking for, expecting an RFE, And then once we have the RFE, we give the additional 20.
Okay, but that's a best case scenario.
It's a best case scenario, yeah.
Sometimes they come back and it's, prove us a negative. I mean, like, you
Yeah.
can't, or they completely come up, they're using the wrong, burden of proof, like you talked about
Yeah.
earlier, or, it's like they're mixing up visa categories. And
Yeah, it's like plug and play, right? You take any template and then you plug and play stuff. So we see RFEs that quote the wrong law, the wrong cases. We see RFEs that have have different names, right?
Do you have a question?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
what happens if you already sent everything and they send you an RFP? Do you send the same paperwork again?
Sometimes we'll send the same stuff, but so I always say, send the same plus. So maybe a couple more documents, put those up front, and, what I want to do is I want to tell them, go to hell, go reread what you're doing, do your homework, but obviously we don't want to be adversarial. The reason why is because if an RFE, if you give the same stuff where you just say, hey, officer, go read it again, they have every discretion to say, okay, fine, denied, right? You didn't give us an additional, give us additional after that. Now, there's recourse after the RFE, right? Which is in the form of like a motion to reopen and reconsider, an appeal even, right? But what does that do? That adds additional time to having this person working in the United States, and and companies don't have time as a luxury. Companies are businesses, right? They need people working. So the RFE, what we do is we start to get a little creative, and here's some highlights real quick. We are starting to see a trend towards fewer RFEs in certain categories. So that means that they're starting to catch up on their case log a little bit. And it goes to President Biden's kind of initiative where he's come out and said that we really, really want to push through benefits for certain visas and processes. So some of that is coming to fruition. There's also been an extension on flexibilities to the RFE response. Usually you're only given 90 days. They added an additional 60 days on top of that for companies to respond, right? What does that mean? That means we need more time, so you take more time. And then, the return of USCIS custom of giving credence to previously approved cases when facts are identical. That one is interesting because there have been cases that were approved before. When President Trump was in office, he said, that his administration said, we don't actually have to look at the first one. We can review this anew, afresh. Now they're saying, no, you have to give deference a little bit to the previous filing that we had. If it was approved then and things haven't changed, it's probably still good, right? But you still have officers that are probably used to the old way of doing things that are still reviewing and all of that. So we're starting to see that change, which, we immigration lawyers, we want stability at the White House. We don't care who it is. Just give us stability because each time you change, this stuff changes, right? All the time. So that's the dreaded RFE, what's happening. So just some trends. And Kelly and I, we hear this at different conferences. The U.S. government is still, when it comes to immigration, what's their number one thing? To make sure that there's protection of U.S. workers. And that's a good aim to have, right? But the way that they've implemented it with USCIS is there's going to be a certain percentage of cases that are going to be RFE'd, because you have to they report this, by the way, to the public. And then there are some that are going to be denied. So even cases where it's absolutely clear that they meet the level of review, sometimes they're just denied, right? And companies are really upset about that, but that's just kind of the lay of the land sometimes. Now, knock on wood, we definitely have a very, very high success rate. Most attorneys do. I mean, you really have to be egregious in not knowing the law in order to get a bunch of denials. But we see them every now and then, right? And usually when we refile after that, then they're approved, which is interesting, right? So they deny it, and then you have recourses. You can say, we want to reopen and reconsider it. We want you to refile it. Certain companies have this option called a blanket, which means that we're going to go back to the consulate and get it, right? So there's this visa, the L1, the intercompany transfer that I spoke about earlier. You can file it at USCIS, or you can, if you have a blanket, you can file for it at the U.S. Embassy or consulate abroad. The latter is much easier.
Because it's the State Department and the consulates, And they have a little bit, their rules are a little different.
Yeah. Yeah, the way they review things are much more kind of straight to the point. They understand the blanket. They know that the blanket was created so that companies can easily transfer individuals in and out of the United States. That was what Congress's intent was for the L1. But USCIS, they're under a different mandate, protect U.S. workers. So that's why they look at this a little more difficult. Yes, absolutely.
Can you explain what the blanket is?
Yes, so the blanket is reserved for companies that are global, and they're constantly transferring people in and out of the United States. So how you qualify for one is if you have more than one office around, at least in the United States, and then around the world. So usually a lot of companies like your Samsungs, your Googles, your Facebooks, but even your mid-sized companies, they have blankets, right? If Safeguard was a global company, which I think they are, right, they probably might have a blanket too. You have to have a gross annual income in the U.S. of over 25 million, or you're filing more than 10 L1s a year, or your workforce is at least 1,000. So one of those categories, okay? And so, and you're doing business all around the world. So if you qualify for that, you get a blanket. And what we do is we want companies to get the blanket, because if they get the blanket, then that's a pre-approved kind of approval for every single entity where it's anticipated that you will have workers coming from. Is already approved by USCIS once.
Well, and they are approving the relationship, because that's another part of the L is you've got to have a qualifying
Yeah.
relationship, meaning they have to be related somehow, a subsidiary or parent or affiliates. And so that means immigration has already blessed that relationship between the parent or U.S. office or, the listings there on that blanket. So when you go to the consulate, you basically, that part's kind of done.
Yeah, yeah.
And then you just explain why the person's needed in the United States.
Right.
So if you, let's say that, if you're doing your first L1 visa, can you go ahead and apply for the blanket if you meet one of the qualifications?
So,
And we
great
plan on
question.
having more L1
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. So if you have the relationship, right? You have companies around the world. Your U.S. sales. I get the blanket on this one. If your U.S. sales, your gross sales, all the offices in the U.S. are over 25 million. That's how you get it. Or your work base more than 1,000 employees.
You have the U.S. sales above 25. We just opened offices in Canada.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any other offices outside of Canada. We do have workers outside of Canada, but they're not,
Subsidiary.
they're all under contract right now,
Yeah,
because we haven't figured out.
Yeah. So you've been using.
I can talk to you.
So you've been using like a combination of the L1 and the TN for any Canadian workers coming in?
Yes.
Yeah, so you would definitely want to look at the L as an option, L blanket as an option. Good thing about a Canadian office, you have other visa options that you can get around.
They don't have to get a visa.
Yeah,
for their
that's it.
passport.
Yeah, they can apply at the U.S. border or the
Yeah,
airport.
airport.
Yeah.
They're coming back and forth for meetings
Yeah.
and site visits, it makes it harder.
But let's say you get another office elsewhere and another office elsewhere, and you get projects in the United States, and those are growing, and you need to find individuals that you don't necessarily have to train because they're used to the way the company does things. That's when that blanket becomes invaluable.
Because the most common RFE we would get is if we were extending like an L, and we're saying, this person's an L1B, somebody that has a specialized knowledge of what the company does. And it became almost impossible
Yeah.
to prove, I'd show he's worked on the project, they've been planning it, he's, a major part of the implementation in the Gulf of Mexico or something like that. And, well, why can't a U.S. worker? Well, that's not in the regulations anywhere. Why can't a U.S. worker? It's,
It's a policy.
yeah,
Yeah.
you want to be able to conduct business, and an employee, regardless of where they're sitting, is your employee. And, that should be enough of a nexus to get them in here.
But just to bring it back,
We're having that issue right now.
oh, you are, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like there's nothing is ever gonna be enough to prove it to them,
But to bring it back home to the RFE, we paint this bleak picture, but just FYI, they're overcomable,
It's
right?
it's getting better.
It's getting better, and the requests for evidence, most of the time, they're not rooted in the law. Your lawyers, or they should be helping you navigate those RFEs and providing you options. The big thing with the RFE and USCIS and dealing with them today is the management of expectations, especially because we're HR, right? So meaning everything falls back on us, right? It's our fault, right? Just like lawyers, we get the feeling too. So lawyers and HR, whenever we partner together in immigration, the business, the managers, the employees, it all is our fault, right? So right, the practical, exactly.
My friend
Yes.
got his.
My friend, I went
Got his in 2
online, yeah,
days.
all that. So what it comes down to though, is the practical takeaway for this section is all about the management of expectations up front. So it's, hey, this is the lay of the land, this might happen, this is our contingency, this is what we should do. Okay, so that's what we want to talk about on the RFE. And then Kelly, you have some more USCIS stuff.
Okie dokie. So, what they're doing to clear out the huge backlog. So right now, if you have an employee who has filed for their green card, and they filed as an international executive or manager or under a national interest waiver, they may have filed their adjustment application to adjust from an L or an H or, whatever status they're in to the green card. Those adjustment applications are all backed up. The reason is you've got to get the company petition or the waiver, a national interest waiver, you've got to get those approved first before the whole green card can be approved. Those are all backed up now, and they would not allow premium processing. So somebody thought, wow, why don't we charge, if we accept $2,500 for each one of these, we can hire more people and get them cleared out. So that's what they're doing now. So what they have been doing, this is the second round. So petitions that were received now, it's before July 1st of 2021, you can do premium. They had started this a few months ago, and if you filed, I don't know, probably March of 2021, now they're gradually moving it forward and allowing people to give them money to process the case. You already pay a filing fee of $700. So now you pay $2,500, but what that's doing is once those are approved, those I-485s, they can give the people the green cards, and they're pushing it through that way. They're going to expand premium processing, which, what a novel idea. Let's, look at ways we can take $2,500 on other applications. So to clear out their backlog, they are going to start accepting that premium, and hiring more people and clearing out the backlog. So when you have an employee that is complaining, my green card's taking so long, this is the problem. Those I-485s are hanging out there. And they start with the oldest cases first. So they're trying to free up space by pushing out these petitions so they can get the whole case done. It says, the I-45s are still taking a long time, and that's the last step in the green card. But they're working on it, that the goal is to improve those and get those pushed out. They're going to expand their premium processing. They are recruiting for personnel big time. The government is, like everyone else is. Back pre-pandemic, anytime an employer filed a green card or sponsored an employee, they had to go for an interview, like a family-based immigration case. And the people at the district centers, like in San Antonio and in Houston, in Dallas, the personnel were just in a panic because they don't even have, at the time, didn't have enough people to handle the family-based. You sponsor your spouse, or your brother, or for citizenship interviews. And they didn't even know how to interview these cases because they don't process them. So once they realize that there's not an overrun of fraud, they realize this is a big waste of time and money. Thank goodness they've stopped doing that. Okay, so U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I feel like often there's not enough discussion about this part, this arm, but it's really important because, now everybody travels so much. And these are the gatekeepers. They're the folks that are at all the airports. They're at the land border crossing. If you go down to South Texas, they are actually in the interior of Texas. And their goal is to make sure that everybody that enters, has had the proper security. So what they did is, when the E and L spouses were eligible for work authorization, we started calling the local office, and we would say, hey, can we send our person down there, our client, so you can give them a new I-94 that has an S on it? And they're like, absolutely not. We're too busy for that. The Immigration Service came out with this great idea. Let them figure it out. And I'm on the liaison committee with CBP. And, we would meet there in Houston with the head of the airport. And she was like, no, we don't have enough people to fix your I-94s. So what they ended up doing is they created, I guess, a special algorithm and went into their system. When you come in, if you're a foreign national, it used to be you'd write on the plane that little white card. Now, when they come through, that information's entered into their system. You get home, your employee gets home, and they can print out their I-94. They went in, and if you were an E spouse or an L spouse, they now put an S on there. So what I'm telling clients, they'll say, well, my wife doesn't have her EAD. Well, your wife is an L2. She doesn't need an EAD. Go and print out a new I-94. That S is going to be there. So that was, it's like, wow, that was pretty easy for y'all to figure out, So this is a big problem. Again, with the I-94s, people go through the airport. They don't print out their I-94s for months. They need to have them right away to show they're here legally. But there are often mistakes on them, like they'll put the wrong name or the wrong expiration dates. That's the most common. And we used to be able, like in Houston, go to deferred inspection, the customs office, and they would correct it. Now, a lot of other offices in the country will do that over an email. So Houston kept telling us, we're not going to do it. We're not, we don't have time for people to come down here. We're not going to take your emails. We'll maybe give you 2 days a week where well, if you entered in Houston but you live in Oklahoma, that's a problem. So what you can do is, if you've got someone here that entered through Miami, they can't go back to Miami and get that fixed. A lot of the different offices throughout the United States, the customs offices, will allow you to send them an email and they'll fix it. I had a client whose wife, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, on global entry, she didn't update her global entry, and instead of coming as a Canadian TN, they just put her down as a visitor. Well, her stay ended a long time ago. And so I said, let's try the office in Milwaukee or somewhere. And sent them an email, and they fixed her I-94. They went into the system and fixed it. So that's good, because we used to charge clients to take them down to deferred inspection. And then they were able to go by themselves, and then they just kept narrowing the window of when people could actually go. So just keep in mind, if you have an employee whose I-94 was incorrectly marked when they entered, they can get it corrected through, it doesn't have to be where they entered. Okay? So in-person visits aren't always required. That's a real hassle if you've got a child that's in school or something. You gotta take them out of school, take them to, so you can get those fixed online. So one thing I always get questioned a lot about is your global entry, your trusted traveler program for both, we're all eligible for it. Our clients, your employees use it a lot. But it has become like everything else, just a mess. So you can go online, you pay your application fee, and then you can't get an appointment to go in for your interview, for your final, that's a final step. And then, you're able to go through security, a shorter line, you don't take off your shoes. It can be the difference between making a flight or not. So, in Houston, we used to be able to go down to the library and have our final appointment. Well, they closed that, and they had some other places, and they don't have enough people, so they've closed those. So you can make appointments, and then, look for a cancellation. I didn't realize how many of my clients use this, and they're all complaining about it. So that's the best way to do it. The way I did my application is I would come through there and I could see in Houston, like they had an office where you could just go in and finish it. But I was like, I'm ready to get home. I don't want to mess with this right now. And then I realized I'm never going to get an appointment. So I just went to this one area, and of course they freak out when you're kind of hanging around at the entry area, so you can always get somebody to help you. Because they're like, what's that woman doing over there? So they came over, and I was able to, they fingerprinted me, and they did my whatever with my face, my picture. But I felt like they were scanning my eyes or something, but because it was weird. And then that was all I had to go through. So if you travel internationally, or if you have employees that do, and they are telling you, I need to get my global entry, that's probably the best way to do it, is get it done at the airport when you are returning from your next international flight. It's possible they're going to allow virtual appointments. That would be awesome. So whenever you have an employee that uses the program, they have got to update their status. It never fails. It's mainly my Canadians. They will come through and they don't update when they get an extension. So the default is to let everybody in as visitors. So then I've got somebody that's been working here for 6 or 7 months and working illegally as a visitor because usually it's the guys. I had to get through. I didn't want to wait. I didn't update my documents. You see, he's nodding. My paperwork. And now I'm like, but you can't be working, So you've got to update that information, or that's a big O problem. Also, what we're hearing is coming through here from international flights, coming through Austin is apparently great. Everybody loves coming through Austin. Houston, Dallas, not so much. San Francisco, not so much. Or actually, San Francisco's good. JFK's really, really good. I've worked with them before to get people into the country for emergencies, and they're super helpful. So, but
Newark is the best kept secret, by the way.
Newark?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think it's good when you have employees that travel a lot to register with this. I have it. It's never been that big of an issue. I'm not like trying to catch flights or anything, but these are the problems we're having, just so if you have anybody ask you about it. I didn't realize it had gotten that bad, but it has. Okay, so best practices for managing an immigration program. I think what's really important is whoever it is that you're working with, You need to have service level agreements. You need to know what the timing's going to be, like for deadlines. How do you escalate matters? And because you've got to be able to manage the expectations of the folks that you work with. And if you know what the deadlines are, if you know how long it's supposed to take for them to respond to an email, I mean, people like really lose it when they don't get an email response. And I get it, because this is like really important to them. And if you've never sat down with whoever it is you work with and say, look, how long are you going to take to respond to their email? You know, well, we do pretty good. We'll get back to them. No, we want to say within 24 hours. How long do we anticipate, like when we ask you to start a petition, like an L, when are you going to reach out to our employee? Because we need to be able to tell them. Is it going to be 24 hours, 48 hours? What are these kind of deadlines? If there's a problem on a case, who do we go to notify of these problems? This stuff needs to be nailed down. It was, okay, I hate to say it. During the pandemic, it was great. Nobody traveled, so we didn't have any messed up I-94s or anybody getting hung up anywhere. People are traveling again. You got to make sure when they travel, they let you know, so you can either pull up their I-94 or they can. Because that's when you got to spot it to find out everything's okay. You got a family of 5, there's usually going to be something wrong with one of the I-94s. Or they'll let one of the kids in it as a visitor, crazy things like that. I think it's super important that your employee have, the ability to speak with their attorney. In immigration, we have dual representation. We represent the company, we represent the foreign national. You can prevent stuff from going south so fast if everybody just talks. And everybody, they know what to expect. I mean, if you think about it, this is huge for them and their family, especially the green card part of it. You got to keep them in the loop. They need to have full access and a complete understanding of what's going on. I think there is a real trend moving towards, it's going to be self-serve, and it's like, you go in and he needs an L visa and he can watch this video and blah, blah, blah. There's always going to be questions. It's still a legal process. There's still liability to the company. If something is done incorrectly or if a person overstays, they may not be coming back here for a long time. And then if they have a visa that's denied, they're not going to another country either. So it's not just, again, a self-service kind of function. I also think it's hugely important that whoever it is you're working with to provide training and guidance. And I'm not talking just about changes in the law or policy of the United States. If you send a group of U.S. citizens to work in Guyana or, Mozambique, they need to, we need to be able to educate you about this is what you're going to look forward to. These are the how far ahead we got to get started. These are some of the issues we're going to have, and this is the segment of your employee population that may be better suited. You may not want to send children. I mean, there's a lot of different things. So you've got to be able to work with them, and they've got to be able to provide, training, mentoring, guidance to not just your office, but to your the managers, the people that are planning these projects. A lot of times they bid on projects, and then by the time they need to send somebody down, it's like, no, nobody can go. You bid on a project that is not, we can't send people to that country, or it's going to take us 9 months to get them into that country. Everybody's going, mm-hmm. But it happens a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. It's been fun.